Robert Mugabe is an African leader, and he was involved in the Rhodesian Bush War. Right? People don't seem to realize that prior to what is now Zimbabwe, there existed a white settler colonialist state called Rhodesia. Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Scholarship Program is also named after Cecil Rhodes. And Rhodesia was an apartheid state, and it was horrendous. And the land was owned by white settlers. People were exploited. They talk about, sundown towns where they brought in the African people to labor and work, but if they were there after dark, they could be killed. Horrendous stuff. It was apartheid in South Africa, but it was Rhodesia. There was this thing called the Rhodesian Bush War, in which the African people, with the aid of the Soviet Union and China, they formed ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, and ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union. One was the Maoists and one was the pro-Soviet group, and they fought against the British and against the Rhodesian settler regime. And the war went on, and finally the war ended. And it ended with the Lancaster Agreement, the Lancaster House Agreement, a peace treaty that was signed. And the peace treaty, you read the terms of the peace treaty. So, Rhodesia was toppled. They created Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe, the new government, was required to start paying the retirement pensions of all the people who worked for the old government. Ian Smith, who had been the leader and basically the dictator of the apartheid Rhodesian government, Ian Smith, despite the fact that he killed whole villages and exterminated people, had committed a huge amount of war crimes, was never arrested. He even was allowed to have a seat in the government, never faced any penalty for his activities. And there was an agreement that no property would be seized for 10 years following the peace treaty. So Rhodesia, the white settler colonial state, was wiped off the map. Right? They say that wipe off the map means kill everybody. No. Rhodesia, the white settler colonial state, was wiped off the map, just like the Dutch East Indies was wiped off the map. A colonial settler state got wiped off the map, and there was not a genocide. There wasn't killing of white people in mass, right? Most of the white people kept their land at first. Ian Smith, the leader of the former apartheid colonial regime, got to keep his big mansion and have a role in the government even though he had committed mass murder and war crimes and genocide, no penalty. And Robert Mugabe, the leader, was like the Ho Chi Minh or the Kim Il-sung or the Mao of Zimbabwe. He became the president, and he won the elections because he was popular. He was the face of the anti-colonial uprising, and he united the Maoists and the Soviets into one organization, ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, which is a Marxist-Leninist communist party. They took power, and they presided over a capitalist free market state. They followed to the letter the Lancaster House Agreement, and they didn't violate it. And then, starting in 1997, they began to nationalize some of the land and redistribute it to the African people. Land that had been seized by colonialism, by white settlers with machine guns who had gunned down whole villages and seized land. They redistributed it with compensation in many cases. They began redistributing land. And all of a sudden, the media that had praised Mugabe, right? Because when the struggle against apartheid in South Africa was going on, Mugabe was held up as a good example. Nelson Mandela was described as a dangerous radical, but Mugabe, look, he didn't touch any of their property. Mugabe was actually, being treated, by the Western media as if he was a good example. But then, finally, when the time came, Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF government began redistributing land. And all of a sudden, I'll tell you, Mugabe's name had never been on TV. Nobody knew who he was except for people that really closely followed. But all of a sudden, U.S. media went into overdrive about Robert Mugabe's a dictator. Robert Mugabe's an evil dictator. He's taking land. Oh, he's racist against white people. Oh, my God. I had never seen it before. It was unbelievable. And all of a sudden, all these people who'd never heard of Mugabe before, never protested, against the government of Saudi Arabia that cuts gay people's heads off. All of a sudden, they were morally outraged about Mugabe being homophobic, which he was, and it was so contrived, so contrived. Immediately, all the big Western corporations that were seeing their property being seized, it was unbelievable. And as China began to invest in Zimbabwe, which they did, right? One of the biggest waterfall in the world, the Victoria Falls. Who do you think that's named after, mind you? The Victoria Falls, right? Victoria Falls, named after Queen Victoria, right? No, colonialism, right? China worked with Zimbabwe to build a road getting to Victoria Falls so tourists could come see it. To build a hotel near the Victoria Falls. So, just basic, taking a really poor African country and trying to have some level of economic development. And the response is, this is a brutal regime that must be overthrown. This is a brutal communist dictator. Oh, my God. And the foundation money for gay rights activists, they were out there. He's a homophobe. And we were told he's a ruthless... And then, so we put sanctions. The United States put sanctions on Zimbabwe, right? I believe there was even a national emergency declared so we could punish Zimbabwe some more. And then, of course, they're having economic problems. So then, of course, see, socialism is starving people. Oh, the communist regime is starving. It's the same old story we've always seen. The exact same story. When I was in Russia for the World Festival of Youth and Students, I had the honor of meeting with young people from the Zimbabwe African National Union. Young people who love their country and are trying their hardest to get their people out of poverty. And, is that to say there's not a huge amount of corruption in Zimbabwe like there is in every developing country? No, there's a huge amount of corruption in Zimbabwe. But the notion that the government of Zimbabwe has no right to redistribute the farms, wrong. The notion that the government of Zimbabwe has no right to nationalize the diamond mines, and so the people of Zimbabwe make wealth from one of their greatest exports, diamonds. They're 13% of the world's diamond exports, I believe. Robert Mugabe is a communist. Was a communist. And he led the people of one of the poorest countries on earth in overthrowing a white settler colonialist regime, redistributing the land, and trying to get the people out of poverty. And there were some successes. They've wiped out illiteracy in Zimbabwe. One of the highest literacy, I shouldn't say they wiped it out, but it's one of the highest rates of literacy on the African continent in Zimbabwe. That's an achievement. Redistributing land, that was a good move. They've enabled people that were without property, people in the military who fought for the revolution, to have a little piece of land and have their own farm. Good for them, right? They've nationalized the diamond mines so that when diamonds are pulled out of the earth in Zimbabwe, the profits don't go to some big international corporation like De Beers. Instead, they go into the hands of the state treasury of Zimbabwe, and they can maybe build some more healthcare clinics and all of that. They're doing the best they can. But you have to remember, this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And, you have a communist revolution in one of the poorest countries in the world, and then what? And then what? Right? And I'm not saying everything he ever did was right. Some of the anti-gay statements he made were atrocious. I don't defend that. Corruption, big problem with corruption. And I know in the final years, he wanted his wife to be the successor in the party. And that was not what the people of the Zimbabwe African National Union wanted. And there was a big internal fight, and he was kind of pushed out of politics by his own party. By the Communist Party, the ZANU-PF party. They pushed him out of politics because he was wanting his wife to be his successor as the president, and the people of Zimbabwe and the ruling Communist Party, ZANU-PF, they didn't want it. And so there you go. So it's complicated. But Mugabe, overall, his legacy is getting rid of Rhodesia. His legacy is redistributing land. His legacy is fighting against illiteracy in that country. His legacy is nationalizing the diamond mines. And so his legacy overall, I think achievements were made, and I think good things were done. Does that mean that there weren't serious violations of human rights? Does that mean that there weren't issues with corruption? I'm not denying the bad things that happened. He certainly had no love for gay people. I was at the UN. I remember when I was at the UN and he said, "We are not gay." That was interesting. But hey, you know, he's an anti-colonial fighter, fought for his people, and raised people, you know, tried to take measures to get his country out of poverty. I think that the demonization of Robert Mugabe as a dictator, as just, oh, this evil, rotten dictator, horrible man, did not, that's a lie. Robert Mugabe represented the anti-colonial struggle of the people of Zimbabwe. There would be no Zimbabwe if it weren't for Mugabe. And there would be no tourism, really. I mean, the tourism in Zimbabwe, his work with China, I think the man is being subject to a post-mortem smear campaign. And that's not right. It's not right, the way they're dancing on his grave right now. I think the average people of Zimbabwe, the working people of Zimbabwe, saw him as their champion and really benefited as a result of his leadership. And as hard as it was, and as poor as Zimbabwe is and still is, he was somebody who stood up for his people. And I don't appreciate the way the media is dancing on his grave. I think that he did some very, very good things for the country.